Suicide. It's a taboo subject in many cultures, viewed as the ultimate act of desperation, and it remains the 8th leading cause of death in the United States, that according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. On the program today, we're going to take an inside look at suicide from a psychological sciences perspective and from a poignant sharing by those left behind. And later in the program, if there were a natural disaster, would you know what to do? What's in your kit? We're going to talk about that later in the show. Outlook is next. Stay with us. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Outlook. I'm Barbara Deeb. Well, on the program today, would your family be able to survive a natural disaster? Later in the show, we're going to give you some pointers on what to put in that disaster preparedness kit. After all, it is the month that they set aside for disaster preparedness. But first on the program, 30,000 Americans die by suicide each year. And what's even more shocking is that an additional 500,000, that's almost 500,000, have attempted suicide each year. Would you know what to do if you received a cry for help? Joining us on the program today are two individuals in the know. Dr. Stephen O'Connor joins us. He's with WKU's Psychological Sciences Department, an assistant professor there, has done a lot of research on suicide. And also joining us right now is Caitlin Simpson. She lost her brother to suicide in 2005, and she's used that loss as a catalyst for action, for awareness. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Before we get started, okay, it's a little, like I say, it's a delicate subject. It's a little uncomfortable when you're talking with someone about suicide. So maybe help us from your perspectives. Help us with the language. What's the proper way to say, did so-and-so commit suicide, or did they die from suicide? What's the verbiage that's correct?
Well, the CDC has its nomenclature for self-directed violence, and it's a spectrum from non-suicidal self-injury, suicidal ideation, suicidal planning, suicide attempts, and then death by suicide. So it's a full spectrum of self-directed violence.
But if I'm going to see her after this incident happened and I want to express my condolences, would I say, I'm so sorry that your brother committed suicide, I'm so sorry that he died from suicide? How do you feel comfortable?
They say die by suicide so that it's more of a whole thing instead of just an action, so that you can kind of look at it from different perspectives and not focus on the actual, what am I trying to say, the actual how it happened.
Right, exactly, yeah. Without having to get into those kinds of things. And then we talk about attempted suicides, successful suicides. Is any suicide successful?
Yeah, no, that's not a term that you'd want to use, successful and unsuccessful, because it sort of makes people feel judged about this action that they engaged in, and it's way more complicated than that. I think, like what you were saying in terms of thinking about it like a bigger issue, I think as a clinician and researcher, we don't think about it like an outcome. We think about it like a big construct, like you would love or hate. Something that's very complicated, multifaceted. And when you work with people and you try and study it, you try and understand it from a lot of different directions.
And also, when you are a survivor of someone who there's a lot of do's and don'ts on how you need to share your story to be effective and to not, always go into super detail and, make it about that action and about the whole subject.
Which is exactly what you're saying.
Right,
that
exactly.
It's got so many tentacles, it's so multifaceted, but it needs to be looked at in the bigger sense. That
on both parts.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Definitely.
And it's a whole spectrum of prevention, too. You have trying to reach people before they develop suicidal thinking, try to help them when they are suicidal, and then postvention is prevention. So when people lose someone to suicide, they survive the death of someone else's suicide. You want to intervene with them and help them with the processing, because that's suicide prevention too.
I want to hear your story, and I appreciate the fact that you're sharing that story, but is there a genetic link? Are we doing enough research on the subject of suicide to find out some indicators that might help us in the prevention process?
Yes, I think in a lot of ways we have. The field is kind of really, it's developed at a very quick rate compared to where it was a few decades ago. There's no one genetic linkage that is going to indicate that someone's at increased risk. There's some research that was done recently out of Johns Hopkins where they showed that there was a collection of genetic vulnerability that was associated with death by suicide, but that's one outcome, and it's probably something to do with emotion dysregulation, and it's probably associated with a lot of other difficult outcomes too. It just happens to be that the thing that they were trying to link it with was suicide death. So that itself was associated with death by suicide, but you can't say that it's a one-to-one match and that that's the one thing. I think generally what the field has been able to demonstrate in terms of suicide prevention is that lethal means restriction is actually pretty effective. So
not having access
not
to
having
the means.
access, you got it, and locking them up. So it's not about necessarily taking away people's rights to own firearms or anything like that. It's just how do you be more responsible about storing that so that you can prevent a really terrible outcome. And then I think getting people into evidence-based treatments where you're actually treating the things that make them suicidal. So you're not just giving people an antidepressant medication because you think that suicidal thinking is just a symptom of depression. I think that the field has tried that for a long time. It's been unsuccessful because the rate of suicide hasn't changed across 20 years. But we do know that if you can get evidence-based treatments, we can help people reduce the risk of making suicide attempts and then most likely reduce the likelihood that they'll end up killing themselves.
Well, and the research that I was doing indicated that 80 to 90% of those who attempt suicide have some type of emotional or mental illness.
That's true. I mean, it's part of the story. The way that we think about it is that there's sort of this indirect mix of difficulties, psychosocial problems that people are dealing with, poverty, mental illness, substance use, but lots of people have those and they don't want to kill themselves. So what we try and really focus on is what's directly linked to you having suicidal thinking. People feeling like a burden, people feeling like they don't belong, people feeling emotionally dysregulated or hopeless about the future. Those are the things that you target in a successful suicide treatment.
Let's talk about your brother Houston. Okay, you were very close in age, I understand.
Yes, they're about
15.
15 months apart.
And so it was 10 years ago now.
It was 10 years ago in June, which just seems crazy. I was telling him that, I've always been pretty proactive in my grief process. I got counseling. I talked to my friends. I've sought help. I definitely believe you're in charge of how you want to live your life, and to an extent. And so I've really seeked out ways by putting myself into suicide prevention to help. I was telling him, I don't know if it was the 10-year mark, but this year has been one of the more emotional years for me. And he was explaining that a lot of times the grief process can take a decade. And that is something I I didn't know that, but now I can tell other people that. But, there's not a guideline on grieving. And so, that's been, that's one of the hardest parts, I think, for family is like, when am I not going to feel this pain? When am I going to get some joy out of a death, which can happen? My brother was a great person, selfless, took very good care of me, our family. At his funeral, everybody came up and said, oh, your brother did this random act of kindness. I mean, he was just all over the place and impacted people's lives that I would have never known about. And so, to really understand, to have that empathy and try and really understand what's happening, will help in your grief process, or has helped me. But I'm a decade out and I'm still learning every day, something different.
That it's a process.
And it's not going to happen overnight, and I'm thankful that I still grieve. And I know that might sound a little crazy, but it makes me feel like, that I'm being proactive and that I'm trying to better myself
and
because of
understand.
His death.
Sure.
Right.
Speaking of bettering yourself because of his death by suicide, you've also been very proactive in the community in creating a walk and getting people and just appearing on shows like this just to get awareness out there.
That's correct. This was our fourth walk this year, and we actually raised $14,000, and we had about 200 and something walkers. A lot of people didn't register.
And just showed up.
Well, no, that's fine. But when they get there, like my husband didn't register, so I counted. So we had 175 people that actually registered, but there was a lot more. So I'm telling everybody 200 plus walkers. But that money has gone into AFSP, the Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So with that, I have spent about $7,000 now. I plan to spend a lot more now that I've met Dr. O'Connell and going into the school system, trying to get some materials
out there
and have people a little bit more prepared. And then I also have a survivor of suicide group that meets the third Thursday of every month at the Wellness Center by the 5th Street Diner. And there it's a grassroots. No one's we're a professional. I guess I'm a little bit more professional in my grief process, but we're just kind of there to listen, and I'm going to get some speakers in.
And just know that you're not alone.
Yes, and
just know that you're not alone.
It is super. I mean, I knew that I would learn something from these meetings, but I have learned a lot more by going to these meetings every month. And
tell me how old your brother was.
He was 21.
He was 21. Let's talk about the age specifications, if you will. I was shocked to learn that it's usually seniors, that we have a greater incident of seniors who commit suicide.
Yeah, 2013 was the most recent data from the CDC, and based on that data, the highest risk group was 46 to 64. Approximately 18.1% for every 100,000 people in that age group killed themselves. And the next highest group was seniors, 85 and above. So, it's a major issue across the life spectrum. You also have the highest proportion of suicide attempts that are happening, in the younger population too. They're less likely to die, but they are making a lot of suicide attempts compared to
But I was shocked
suicide.
at the ratio. It apparently, according to the research, that the ratio is 10 to 1, that there will be 10 attempts to one. We're not going to call it successful, but one
Deaths by
actual
suicide.
death
Yeah,
by
I mean, it's
suicide.
around 12 to 1, and it's about 40,000 people in the most recent year.
And Kentucky's above average as well from the national. I think
Average.
it's every 12.5 hours that someone dies by suicide in Kentucky. But I think with that generation of what was the ages from like 40 to 65, I mean,
46.
that is an age where you might have gotten laid off because they're trying to find a younger, more
Person.
vibrant person. You're still having to take care of your family. There's a lot of stressors. Now with social media, everybody thinks their family is the best family in the world.
And when you find out it's not.
Yes.
But let's talk about some indicators. You might be watching this and sharing this story and wondering, and probably know someone maybe across your life spectrum who's come to you and has been very despondent. What are some red flags to look out for? As you look back, do you see those red flags maybe that your brother had?
I guess in the terms of looking back, I think my brother maybe had a euphoria that day. He came and visited a lot of people, but a lot of people, sit in bed and don't get out or give away things or even talk about it.
Or leave a note.
My brother did not. So, you have all these different things around it. But also, you just have to ask the hard questions. Like if you think that someone is breaking plans or, not showing up on time to things that they would normally show up to, I don't think it will hurt to just ask a tough question, like, do you think you would harm yourself? Just knowing that someone is there and asking those questions could definitely save a life.
Yeah, definitely. So isolation is a big one.
A big one, so an indicator at any age.
It is, yeah.
At any
So
age.
in the field refers to those as warning signs. So you have risk factors, which are often static and they're demographic in nature. So I'm a man. I'm at increased risk, 3 times increased risk for suicide compared to women.
So there's a genetic factor there.
Well,
I mean, not genetic, gender. Sorry.
There is a gender, but the gender probably doesn't explain exactly. There's more to it than that, right? But so those are risk factors, and then you have warning signs. So like that's what you're bringing up. What are people doing that's a red flag? Well, isolation's a big one. Acting reckless, driving at really high, fast speeds, putting their life in danger and not worrying about it, making what we think are kind of bad decisions.
Right.
Definitely increase in substance use. And
Giving
just
away stuff.
increased agitation, right?
Yeah.
Making plans,
Right.
right? Retrospectively, you might see that as kind of putting their affairs in order. And so the real honest answer to that is that oftentimes people will tell others that they're having suicidal thoughts.
They will.
More often than not, yes, that they will communicate that to someone else.
And
so
then
we
what?
need
Not being embarrassed to act on it, or, you know, I've had multiple phone calls of my friend, you know, is showing signs or what, you know, just from people that I don't know that have gotten my number, and I automatically send them to AFSP because that's right there, and they have a hotline and such. But it's like, and you know, just the resources, because I mean, I could tell them all day, but I wasn't. Yeah, you know what I mean.
You didn't have that opportunity.
I didn't have that
Right.
opportunity, but I've worked in the field where you know, you have to take things seriously, and it's hard when some play out of where, you know, they want attention. You know, you really have to take it all seriously every time.
Absolutely. Yeah, Marsha Linehan, she's a giant in our field, and she's also someone who's a suicide attempt survivor herself. She developed one of the best therapies for helping suicidal people. She says focus on the function, not the form. So really try and get at what is going on here when people
Right.
are kind of acting out in these different ways. Don't focus on whether or not it's right or wrong.
Right.
Don't judge it. Just
Don't
try and
judge it.
understand a little bit more about why are you acting out of character, and, you know, how can I help you?
Exactly.
And communicate to people that you care about them. One of the biggest reasons people feel like suicide is a way to potentially solve their problems is that they feel like a burden on others. So they say, if I was to remove myself from life, it would increase your quality of life somehow. And the reality is that it's more complex than that. When people are having a hard time, they might be going to the hospital. They require more help. So in some ways, they are a little bit of a burden. But you go into that unjustified level of burden where you say, things would be better off if I killed myself. And into that, when I work with people, I encourage them to actually talk with their loved one, because it's potentially the most important decision they'll ever make in their life. You can't decide that in a vacuum.
That's
Talk with
right.
someone.
No regrets. We're out of time on this subject. We'll have to get both of you back to talk some more.
Anytime.
Thank you. And we're going to put up the website for AFSP if people want to find out more information. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
10 years out, Dr. Stephen O'Connor and Caitlin Simpson have joined us. And when we come back, we're going to find out about disaster preparedness. Would you know what to do in the event of an emergency? Stay with us. Outlook continues. I'm Barbara Deeb. As we mentioned at the beginning of the program, we're now going to talk about disaster preparedness. You know, it's one of those months where we raise awareness, draw attention, but disaster awareness should be there every month. Shouldn't matter if it's September or not. Jana Ray Conway is joining us. She is with the Barren River District Health Department. She is their disaster preparedness person. Say that 5 times real fast.
Yes.
But so you're the person in charge of disaster preparedness. When we talk about a disaster, what I define as a disaster might be very different than what you define, but for purposes of this discussion and this show, we're talking about natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, right?
Yeah, natural disasters is part of it, but you do also have the man-made disasters, because fires will fall on both sides, natural and man-made.
That's a good point. That's a good point. So we often talk about being prepared. What does that mean? You know, I have my little kit. I'm ready for anything.
Yeah, being prepared, basically, to break it down, think of it in 4 steps.
Okay.
One is, first of all, be informed. Know what you're preparing for. What are the disasters or emergencies that occur in your area? Do you live close to a major highway or interstate? You know, because if there's a hazardous chemical spill, you need to know what to do. Find out what you need to be prepared for. So that's part of being informed.
Well, now in our karst terrain too, because we're built on caves,
Exactly.
sinkholes are an issue that might not be an issue in other parts of the country.
Exactly. With sinkholes, you know, that is something that is going to happen. And we know that there are other areas in the country that do experience that. So, you know, that is something that happens. But something we don't have to prepare for is we don't have to worry about volcanoes, and we don't have to worry about tsunamis. So, you know,
Yay!
you stop and think about what else do we, the biggest thing is going to be severe thunderstorms or severe weather in general, whether it be spring or your winter time, because we do get ice storms, and they can definitely bring everything to a halt. So knowing what you need to be prepared for. Then make your plan of what you need to do. What do you need to do during the event, before the event? Part of doing or planning for the event is putting together a disaster kit. So you've got your family plan, what you're going to do during a disaster, and then you've got your supplies that you can either grab and take with you or supplies that you have there at home.
I've got to know this. This question bothers me all the time. Where do you place the disaster preparedness kit? Because guess what? The disaster could happen while you're at work and your kit's in your car or it's at home. So how do you best prepare for that?
Really the best option on that one there is to have actually a kit at home. Have a kit that you have in the car just in case you're not home, but also have a smaller kit at work. You don't have to have a big kit in all of those locations, just kind of a smaller kit for your car and for at work. For at home, you're primarily, you're thinking grab and go. If you've got some supplies out in your car, if you forget to grab your kit, you at least have something in the car. So it's really best to kind of look at it in that way and have actually a little bit more than one.
Right.
But at home, think about where would be an easy place to get to it, to grab it
Access.
and take it, that
Okay.
easy access. The other thing is if you do part of your preparing, knowing what to be prepared for, if you've got a shelter place for tornado, when a tornado strikes, that might be the better place for the kit. That way, if there is a tornado warning and you don't have a whole lot of time to grab the kit from wherever it's located, you've already got it in your shelter.
Location.
Your
That's a
location
good
where
point.
you're going to be sheltering in place.
But the big question is, what do you put in your disaster kit?
Well, as far as in your kit, you're going to want a few items, particularly a whistle. A whistle really comes in handy if you do get trapped. You are in your shelter, you're trapped, and you don't want to really yell for help until you can hear someone coming. If you've got the whistle, they can hear that and they can get closer to your location. That way you save your voice and you can actually talk to them when they find you. So that whistle comes really in handy. A flashlight and extra batteries for that flashlight for when the lights go out. That way you can see to evacuate your home if you need to. Also look at a battery-powered radio to have in that kit. It can be just a small radio. If you do have a weather radio and you go to your shelter during a tornado warning, unplug the weather radio. It's got batteries in it. Take it with you.
Good.
You know, those kind of things to make sure that you've got there with you. Have a little bit of food. Just something that's non-perishable, you know, like energy bars or something like that. Also rotate all of that. Have a few bottles of water in the bag. Now at home, you're going to want to have more water than just a few bottles in
There's
your
a
kit.
ratio, isn't there, per
Yes.
person? I always, okay, tell us
It's
that.
3 gallons per person per day, and you're planning for 3 days.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot of water.
That's a lot of water. It really is. And I've been working on that this past year. That's one of the things that we've been doing with our Brad Citizens Corps Facebook page has been every month we post a few items for your kit. And so I've been going through and actually making sure I had all those items together. And so we've got all that water sitting in the bottom of our pantry. And it comes in handy because our little emergency is we had a water leak break in our line coming from the meter. It was on our side, and we had to turn the water off, and it was about a day and a half before they could
Thankfully,
get there.
yes.
We had water.
You were prepared.
Yes.
She practices what she preaches.
Definitely
That's
practice
a good
that
thing.
one.
So, okay, the 3 gallons per person
Per
per
day.
day for 3
3
days.
days.
Plan for 3 days. So you got the water, you got energy bars, you've got those kinds of things.
Yes.
Medication.
Yes, medication definitely. And if you've got your kit, again, in your shelter, you've got some water in there. If you're trapped in there, at least you've got your medicine and something to take it with. If you're one of those like me that you've got to have water to swallow your pill, you've got something there and you're able to do that. Unfortunately, there was a fatality in West Liberty because the woman, she was in her closet, she was trapped, and she did not have her medicine.
Oh my goodness. So this is disaster preparedness kit, be prepared. So those are good steps. We got the be aware of what's coming your way, what kind of
Yes.
disasters you might encounter. Have a plan. In the event that your family gets separated, you want to have a plan. Where are you all going to meet and how are you all going to keep in touch to know that you're
Exactly.
okay?
You want your communication plan as well.
That's important. What's the best way to handle that?
As far as on your communication plan, the best way on that is to have someone who is out of the area. We usually say an out of the state contact, someone who's going to be long distance call, because generally your local phone lines are going to be overwhelmed to where you can't call locally. Your cell phones are probably going to be down because your cell towers, they're not going to be working, or they're going to be overloaded.
True.
So have that out of state person that you can call, because you're going to get through to them before you can get through to your family member. Tell all the family, here's the phone number.
Check in.
Check in with this one.
That's a
so
good
if you're
one.
the first one to call in, you can say, well, I will call back in about an hour to check in and see if you've heard from the rest of them.
That's a very good point.
Yes.
Very good point. Now, this is something interesting. So we're trying to talk to you out there about being prepared for disasters. But what you told me before we got started was that the way to get people involved in disaster preparedness is through their pets.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me more.
Exactly. We have been working on disaster preparedness and training for the community for 10, almost 15 years. And it's really, you find that people don't seem to get the message for themselves. But when you start talking about their pets and what they could do to prepare their pets for an emergency, especially after Katrina, people realized we've got to take our pets with us. We may not get back to get them. Those pets are wandering out there lost. They have no family anymore. And so they're having to be rescued. Some of them were able to be reunited with their family, but not always. And folks realize that, and they will actually come to a pet first aid and CPR preparedness class where they wouldn't for maybe themselves.
That's very interesting. And this is something now that you are going to be offering.
Yes.
So pet CPR and preparedness. So how do we prep our pets?
To get your pets ready, it's a lot similar to what we do for ourselves. One, of course, having a plan. How are you going to, if you're not home, you might want to talk with a neighbor and say, hey, can you get my pets and bring them to a meeting place? Discuss that, have that as part of your plan. Put them together, a kit as well. That includes identification, their records of their vaccinations, water and food as well. Also include a leash, and if you can, get one of those collapsible carriers that you can collapse down and store with the kit, because believe it or not, even in a disaster, they're going to be scared, they're going to run off.
And so that's a
have
way to
that
contain
leash and have something to contain them with. Also, too, if you're going to a shelter, I know here locally they're working really hard on getting pet-friendly shelters, and that basically what that means is that you can bring your pet and they will have a shelter for your pet that's near where you're going to be sheltering at with the Red Cross. So it's kind of a two shelters in one, so to speak. So they're working on that, and if you've got your own carrier for them, it makes it a whole lot easier for those folks that are going to be setting
Transporting.
you up. Yeah, so if they're going to set
Absolutely.
it up, it's going to be a whole lot easier, and it's a good way to contain your
Your pet.
animal and make sure that you've got them with you.
Jana Ray, always good information. Jana Ray Conway. And you have one of these pet CPR classes coming up in November. We're going to put up a website where you can go and get more information. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
You feel prepared for that disaster? Let's hope we don't have to be
Yes.
prepared, but we'll be prepared. That's going to wrap it up for this week's edition of Outlook. I'm so glad that you joined us. We'll see you next time.